Well, thanks and welcome to Next Up. This is where we interview community leaders. And today, Ray Hartmann and I will be talking to the Secretary of State, Jay Ashcroft, before Tuesday's Missouri primary. Secretary Ashcroft, welcome to 9PBS. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, and everybody get out and vote.
That's the plan. But first, however, we do want to talk about some of the changes that will happen not Tuesday, but in November. Here at 9PBS, we've summarized them, and here they are.
Earlier this summer, Missouri Governor Parson signed House Bill 1878, which modifies Missouri election laws. Two major changes include replacing the presidential primaries with a series of caucuses and now requiring registered voters to provide photo ID when casting their ballots, which will take effect on August 28th, after the primaries, but before November's election. Some other modifications coming into play this voting season will be allowing absentee ballots to be cast without an excuse up to 2 weeks prior to the election, but only in person at your local election authority, as the House bill no longer allows the use of drop boxes for absentee ballots. You can still cast your vote electronically, although machines are not allowed direct internet connection, and come January 2024, the paper ballot will be the only official ballot, and the use of electronic vote counting machines will no longer be used. Local election authorities are prohibited from accepting private donations in most cases, and anyone who solicits more than 10 voter applications must register with the Secretary of State every 2 years. With dozens of provisions over 58 pages, House Bill 1878 got some attention, particularly by voting rights groups who claim voter ID requirements disproportionately affect minorities, the young, and the elderly. Governor Parson said in 2020 and years prior, Missouri had conducted free, fair, and secure elections, but with changing technologies and new emerging threats, we want to ensure they remain that way.
There you have it, some of the changes in House Bill 1878. But Secretary Ashcroft, I think it's important to point out that those changes are not in effect for next Tuesday, correct?
That is correct. If you're registered, you can vote. Show up on Tuesday. Don't worry about what we're going to say till the November election.
You know, among some of the changes that we might want to discuss for November anyway, is that people, if they don't have one right now, will have to get a voter ID, some sort of photo ID. Right now, I think on Tuesday, I can vote with my utility bill. That will not be the case in November, correct?
Yes, for August, we prefer on Tuesday that you show your driver's license. It makes it easier for you to scan in and for us to pull up your information or for using the poll books. But if you have a utility bill or something else like that, you'll still be able to vote on August 2nd. There is a little bit of a misperception about the photo ID law, even when it goes into effect in November. The law is actually true that if you're registered, you can vote. If you don't want to vote a provisional ballot, you need to have that government issued photo ID. But if for some reason you don't have that government issued photo ID, you are still allowed to vote a provisional ballot that's put inside that security envelope. You fill out information about yourself that they can use to verify your identity once the polls close, and you get a little poll tab so you can make sure whether or not that ballot was counted. So if you want to get the normal ballot, non-provisional, you need to have that photo ID. But if you don't have it, as long as you're registered, you'll still be able to vote. And our office is happy to get a free photo ID for the purposes of voting, including any necessary documentation for free for Missourians.
Mr. Ashcroft, Mr. Secretary, I don't know. To me, Mr. Secretary to me.
Call me Jay, Ray. How's
Hey,
that?
all right, Jay. Call me Ray, call me Jay. Let's at about 4 weeks after the election in November 2020, you made the statement that Missouri showed the rest of the country how to do this. And the legislation, and I realized it was the legislature passed it, not you, but the legislature basically seems to have undone some of the things that we showed Missouri, the nation, what to do. What is your, and I understand the arguments about technology, whatever, but does it make a lot of sense that we showed the nation what to do and then we undid what we showed them?
Well, I think first and foremost, what we showed the nation most specifically was that people could go to vote in person during a global pandemic. They could do it safely. We could get results quickly, and they could be results that people could trust. I think anytime you want to have an election, before you kind of focus on photo ID or paper ballots or things that are legitimate discussion points, what you need to decide is, what do you need to have in an election? You need to have access. You want to be able to make sure that every voter can vote. You need to have security. You want to make sure that it's hard to cheat. And I think more so since really the 2016 and 2020 election, we're realizing that we need to do more to make sure that, yes, we have that access. Yes, we have that security, but we also have the necessary transparency and processes so people trust the results. So that regardless if their person wins or loses or their issue passes or fails, they trust it. And I think with what we did in this election bill, we did a lot of things like that. We access-wise, for the 2 weeks before the election, you can go vote in person without a reason for voting absentee. We think some people will really like that. We made it more stringent with regard to the photo ID, but we also made sure that if you were registered, you could vote with regard to the provisional ballots. We looked at the cyber side and said, you know what, let's make sure that we're having penetration testing and cybersecurity testing of our election authorities. Let's make sure that nobody has to rely on just this electronic black box, if you will, and hope that it recorded their vote correctly. Let's make sure there's a paper ballot. And if there's a challenge, let's pull them out. Let's publicly count them. And let's make sure people trust the process.
But here we are going back to the paper ballot, and we're jettisoning the touchscreen, the electronics, which seems a little bit funny, doesn't it, in a nation where everybody's walking around with an iPhone, and electronics are really, quite the thing in 2022. And now we're going back to papyrus, Jay.
Well, what we're really doing, and what you see it in St. Louis, and you're seeing it in most of our other jurisdictions, we're going to a combination of the touchscreen so that we have the ease of use, that people are used to using them. If you need to, you can zoom in to make it larger. But instead of having your vote just tabulated on that computer where you can't really see what's happening, you will get a paper ballot printed out so you can make sure that what you touched on that screen is what's put on that ballot. We need to have credibility in the process. And one of the difficulties with elections that make them different than, people bring up electronic banking or other areas, we both want to have security, but we also want to have the secret ballot. It's not for me to know how Ray votes. That's his secrecy there. With banking, you don't have the same secrecy. So if there's a problem, because you don't have that anonymity, there's a trail. With what we do with elections, the ability to have a trail without anonymity isn't quite the same. So we want to have the good points of the touchscreen, especially because we need to have some electronic ability for people that are differently able, that really couldn't fill out just a number 2 pencil on a ballot for various reasons. But we like that hard copy that when, if there's any dispute, open up the locked box, bring in the witnesses, and let's count them.
Jay, did people in Missouri not trust this election? I mean, we all know the national situation. We don't have to rehash it. You are one of the first people who came out and said Joe Biden is our president. Now, I assume have you changed? Is that your position? I'll give you a chance to say it because some people have changed.
I'm pretty sure he still occupies the White House.
Okay. All right. But I guess my question, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it's a valid question. But one of the things that I think has really become clear in 2016 and 2020 is just because you do it well doesn't mean people understand it was done well. Go ahead.
Okay, so the point is the people, I think you'll agree, at least in this election, maybe not the 16, but in 20, the people who are most concerned about the outcome are the Republicans. I mean, that's not a news story. In Missouri, Donald Trump won by 15 plus points, and he had the lowest victory margin. And I happen to be talking to the guy who had the biggest one. You won by 24 points. You were the only one to hit 60%. So it's kind of, I look at you thinking, well, was this really not a fair election? I mean, do Republicans in Missouri with that kind of outcome really think that they should be distrusting Missouri's elections?
Well, I'm glad you think so highly of how I ran.
No, I'm just saying it's a fact. You won. It's like you won by 24 points. I can't imagine many of your supporters distrusted that result.
I travel to every county in the state every year. I think it's incumbent upon me as a statewide official. And in 16, I was hearing from more your side of the spectrum about concerns. Since 2020, I have been hearing from more my side of the spectrum, not to be antagonistic or anything,
That's
about concerns. And I think when they see things happen in other states, where we see that other states did not follow their own laws at times, that makes them have concerns. And I want to do what I can while we're making sure we have good access, while we're making sure that we have the proper security to ensure that they trust the results. Once they lose trust in the process, it's very difficult to get it back. So as long as I can continue to prove all three of those attributes at the same time, I think that's what I ought to be doing.
But forever and a day, don't you think that there are going to be politicians like Hillary in 2016 or Stacey Abrams in 2018 or Donald Trump in 2020 who are going to cast doubt on the election process because they lost?
And politicians and candidates will say what they say. My job, I believe, is to run the administration of elections so that if people are honest, whether they like me or don't like me, whether they like the administration or not, they will say that that was done fairly. And I am just continuing to strive to do that in a way that protects accessibility, security, and believability.
2020 was a once in a century challenge for people who hold the office of for secretaries of state.
I'd rather not repeat it.
Right, I can understand that. Talk about what your office did to be nimble, to adjust to the pandemic. What were some of the things that, and this is a chance for you to say, what did you do out of the ordinary to adjust to the pandemic?
Well, I mean, probably the first thing that comes to mind, the last week of April, first week of May, or maybe the first 2 weeks of May, I don't remember. I traveled to every election authority in the state in 10 business days. I was driving one car and another individual from the Secretary of State's office was driving a panel van, and we were delivering PPE that either our office had purchased or we had gotten delivered. So we were delivering masks and gloves and hand sanitizers and things like that to local election authorities, trying to make sure people would know that the facilities that they would vote in were secure. I think we saw we sent out close to, if not did, a mailer to maybe every household in the state that we had a registered voter in, making sure they knew about the voting law changes, how they could vote by mail, how they could vote absentee, how they could vote absentee in person, or election day will be safe. Flew around the state in August trying to get out on the media markets, just working with election authorities to make sure they have what they need. We moved the April elections. We had the March presidential preference primary right when COVID was kind of being understood, right before it kind of was accelerating. And then we moved the municipal elections to June. I don't know if that's ever happened in the history of the state, but we needed to make sure that we would have enough poll workers and that we'd be ready for the election. We had talked to the governor to make sure that if we needed National Guard individuals that wouldn't be in uniform to help work the polls, to make sure that that could be done, working with local election authorities to find them larger polling places and finding when we could make sure that we were spreading people out. And if we use the same polling place, How do we move people through the polling place so that they're not crossing each other? Just all the same concerns every business owner had.
Exactly. Now you say we, some of that, the legislature was down for some of this. Some of this initiatives you had to take in your office, right? I mean, it
Well,
wasn't.
yes, but it was, everything we did was legal under the law.
Okay, but the point is, what do you think? I mean, that's a position that someone could challenge. I'm not saying they should, but they could. What would your reaction if Illinois or California, New York, sued Missouri saying, Jay Ashcroft didn't follow his own laws? Because that's what, as you know, Missouri did as part of the Texas lawsuit against Pennsylvania. Was there part of you at all as a Secretary of State, aside from your role as a Republican, that, you really like seeing states sue one another on the allegation that those other states might not have followed their laws?
Well, actually, I don't think it was an allegation, because the appellate court in Pennsylvania actually held that the Constitution had been violated. So it's kind of interesting. Evidently, the appellate court in Pennsylvania found that the Attorney General of Missouri was correct, that Pennsylvania had not followed the law. And I mean,
do they have a Supreme Court there too?
I do not know if the Supreme Court has ruled on it yet.
No,
but
I'm
I
talking
know,
the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania overruled that position, I think, didn't they?
I don't know if that's gone through the court yet. I believe the appellate court decision was maybe early this year or was late last year. So I don't know if it's gone through the full process. But I mean, it's kind of hard to.
Okay. At the time, the courts had ruled in Pennsylvania, obviously, that it was okay. So we'll go ahead.
No, they didn't, Ray. They ruled that the original lawsuit, they ruled that the lawsuit was too early. And then the secondary lawsuit, they ruled that it was too late. I don't believe they ever got to the merits until this lawsuit, where the appellate court actually held that the law had been violated.
We don't want to.
Let me ask you about voter ID, Jay.
Sure.
Some people, you heard in the piece before the program that there are some who believe that if you're elderly or you're young, you're minority, you may have a more difficult opportunity in getting a photo ID. What will your office do to address those concerns?
Well, let me reiterate. I don't mean to be rude, but in the video they said you couldn't vote if you didn't have your photo ID, which is not true. We do have provisional ballots that are required to be counted once identification or your identity has been verified. So the proper thing to say is, if you're registered, you can vote. If you don't have that government issued photo ID, you'll have to use a provisional ballot. But more importantly, to your direct question, our office is happy to provide a non-driver's license, a Missouri non-driver's license, which is a form of ID that's approved under the law, for free to people that do not have it. We are happy and have provided underlying documents to people that need them. Birth certificates, maybe more often happens with women. They might need a wedding certificate or a divorce decree because their name changed after a marital status change. We help roughly 1,000, maybe more people a year do that. We're happy to help anybody in the state of Missouri to do it. It used to be under the law that if you didn't have your photo ID, you would sign a statement, and then we would get those statements. Everybody that showed up and signed the statement that didn't have their photo ID, we would send them a letter letting them know that we'd like to help them. Here's the phone number. Here's how to contact you. Let us help you. So we're happy to help. And if anybody doesn't have that ID, go to our website, sos.mo.gov. Let us know you don't. We would love to help you.
I want to get back to this, and I don't want to relitigate 2020. Seriously, I just want to understand the principle of sovereignty, okay? And that is, Missouri's a sovereign state. And I just editorialize, I'm curious, I'd be surprised if you disagree with this, that other states should not be suing Missouri, whether it's about its gun laws or about its abortion issues or about voting practices. Isn't there a principle, at least there used to be, I think, that we are sovereign states and one state doesn't have any business suing another? You're our chief election official, right? I mean, I think that any Illinois has a right to sue us over your actions. I don't understand that. Can you explain?
Well, what I would say is we are sovereigns, but we're sovereigns that are underneath the supremacy of we have a federal form of government, federalism, a
Right.
federal form of government, and there are definitely times that states sue each other. It's probably not as common as you see people getting sued for car accidents, but it does happen. Sometimes they have good reasons, sometimes they don't. I was not a part of that lawsuit. I just thought it was interesting that you pointed out, why would they do that over alleged things? Well, it turns out at least the appellate court in Pennsylvania said they were right.
It's still alleged. I mean, there's still two sides to that argument, but I don't want to go back to that. I'm just curious on that, but we'll move on. Do you, just to clarify, because this is an issue, there are 27 Secretary of State's election, yours is not one of them. And among the issues in other states are whether legislatures should be able to overrule people such as Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, or people like yourself. What do you think? Do you have a general sense as our Secretary of State about whether your jurisdiction, shall we say, as the chief election official should be something that can be overruled?
Well, the Missouri Constitution says that I'm in charge of elections to the extent provided by statute. And the legislature has the authority, with the signature of the governor or with enough of a majority, to change statute. So I am required to follow statutes in how I run elections, how I run my office. So, without a better factual basis, the legislature gets to write the rules, and as a member of the executive, I implement those.
Jay, I'd like to ask you a little something about the change in the next presidential election. Missourians will no longer have a primary. They're going to vote through caucuses. Is this similar to what goes on in Iowa, for example?
Well, first off, this is another area where there's a lot of confusion. Missourians have actually been choosing the delegates to choose the presidential candidate by caucus. We have had a presidential preference primary. I think that was March 15th in 2020. But then Missouri actually has also had a set of caucuses. And in the caucuses, they determine who the delegates are. And the election has not actually necessarily been binding. And I just told the legislature, testified a number of times, I don't think it makes sense for us to both have a caucus and to have an election. If we're going to have an election, get rid of the caucus and make the election binding and make it determine who the actual delegates are, or get rid of it and do it through the caucus. I think it's wrong that we've kind of been misleading people and telling them to vote in the presidential preference primary when it was the caucuses that really made the decision. I just don't think we ought to do that. When people vote in Missouri, they should know that their votes matter, and the sum total of their votes will determine the outcome.
And so people will gather in church basements or wherever, like they do in Iowa?
As long as we stay a caucus state, they will caucus, and the parties will do that. There's been some talk from legislators about wanting to revisit the issue. And what I've told them is, if you want to get rid of the caucus and have an election where the election actually picks the delegates, where the votes matter, I'm fine with that. But I'm not in favor of ever having elections in this state where your vote doesn't really matter. I think that's
and so as of right now, we're a caucus state.
Yes, as of August 28th, we'll be a caucus state when the law goes into effect. Right now, we are a caucus state in that's how we pick our delegates, but we pretend to be a primary state, which I think is disingenuous.
At the risk of you accusing me of slander, I'll say I agree with you, which you don't need.
That's going to hurt me in the next election.
I was going to say, that's a poison pill right there. I do. I think you're right. I probably would have gone with chosen the primary system over the caucus system, just because I think those caucuses are so funky. I don't really think it makes that much difference. I think what does make a difference is the assault. And let's face it, it's by the former president of what many of us call the big lie. And electronic, do you really, you're obviously an expert on this, do you really think electronic voting systems were in any way rigged in 2020, or that there's really obviously, I'm sure you don't want to say anything about Dominion, but I mean, do you really believe that back to one of Charlie's early points, that in 2022, we can't have security of electronic voting machines?
What I've really said is let's decrease the attack surface. I'm an engineer, have a couple degrees in engineering, did data privacy while I was an attorney. Why don't we do something like we're doing with this law, where we have the ease of use of the touch screens, where if people have a physical disability that would make it so they can't fill it out by hand or something, we make sure they still have the full right to vote. And then let's have an actual paper ballot so that we know it's whether or not it's easy or hard, whether it's likely or not. Let's not even worry. Let's not have to worry about it. Let's just remove that from the equation. So in the future, we don't have to be worried about it, because that we have that paper ballot. And then let's require that our tabulation equipment not only not be connected to the internet, but let's make sure that it's incapable, and let's disassemble it publicly and just be done with it. Let's not have to worry about it in the future. If we're not having the electronics do it, if we have the paper ballot, if it's fully set apart and we can prove that, then we don't have to worry about it. Let's reduce the number of things we have to worry about and kind of focus on the things we do have to worry about and do a better job of that.
We only have about 30 seconds to go. I'm sorry, guys, about 30 seconds to go. What we've been talking about now with those changes, again, that's for November and beyond. Tuesday's primary day, and the existing rules are the rules that Secretary Ashcroft have been dealing with for the past 10 or so years.
Yeah, if you're registered, get out and vote. You can vote, and your vote will make the difference.
Well, Secretary of State Jay Ashcroft, thank you very much for joining Ray and me on this edition of Next Up. We appreciate it. And with this goodbye, we hope you can join us again sometime in the future.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Ray. And thank you for joining us. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you next week. Next Thursday, we'll be talking to Jason Kander, former Secretary of State. We'll join Wendy and me on Next Up.
Donnybrook is made possible by the support of the Betsy and Thomas Patterson Foundation and the members of 9PBS.